Hey class, welcome to part 6 from the 20th century to the 21st century, years 1900 through 2020. 20th century art does not provide much reference about clothing and how it was worn. There are some connections that can be made between the visual arts and dress in areas of the silhouette, such as line and proportion, as well as in the design of textiles. Art Nouveau and Art Deco periods reflected this with obvious distinction. However, other times the connection was weak, subtle, or superficial. Some clothing styles in the US were mass produced in the 1900s. Haute couture was often mimicked by home sewers, dressmakers, and manufacturers of women's dress. The mass production of clothing moved to low wage countries in the 1970s and 1980s, bringing the cost of clothing down. In the years before and after World War I, American designers began to receive recognition. After World War II, they became widely known or publicized due to the press. Motion pictures, television, and the internet emerged, and advances were made in the 20th century. It is unclear whether clothing worn in these media sources followed trends or started them. The historians of this text warn that films set in earlier historic periods may not be relevant as sources of information for garments. They may not be accurately shown for the period depicted. Even when garments are more accurately shown, hair and makeup often reflected the period that the film was created in rather than the period being depicted. Once the press had access to motion picture cameras, more adequate depictions of clothing were obtained. The Edwardian period and World War I. The historical background. Ready to wear clothing provided consumers across all markets with more options. Consumers now had access to more styles at different prices. Clothing was now made for everyone rather than a limited number of consumers. Fashion magazines and advances in transportation accelerated the movement of fashion. The impact of World War I on fashion is still prevalent today. Such influences include plastic surgery, prosthetics, which was used to treat injured soldiers, the sweater, trench coat, and wristwatch. Movies also helped to promote clothing. The effect of the war on fashions. World War I influenced both European and American fashion from 1914 to 1918 in many ways, including style, colors, and fabrics. The shift to more comfortable and practical clothing for women was the most obvious influence of the war. This change came about by default, as the jobs that women took over while men were away at war required more comfortable and practical styles. Jackets and coats followed the lines of the officers' tunics. There was a shortage of wool because this fabric was used to manufacture military uniforms. The shortage gave rise to domestic industries that produced dye-stifs, plastics, man-made rubber, and synthetic fibers. After the war, the public gained access to military clothing through Army surplus stores. The trench coat and wristwatch became popular items that remain in style today. Influences on fashion. French haute couture, Asian art, and societal changes such as women's roles also influenced fashion. Paul Poiret. Paul Poiret reigned supreme in Parisian couture between 1903 and World War I after leaving House of Worth and opening his own design house. He was known to have an eye for vivid color. Poiret was quoted as saying, "I freed the bosom, shackled the legs, but gave liberty to the body." This quote was in reference to him ridding women of corsets but introducing habal skirts, which restricted the movement of legs. Habal skirts and tunics became all the rage in 1912 after he designed this costume for the Le Miniere show. He was the first couture to market a perfume. Fortney. Fortney designed clothing and textiles that were inspired by ancient Greek from 1906 to 1949. His style is considered to be timeless. His most famous gown, the Delphos gown, was inspired by ancient Greek style. This pleated gown had to be repleated after each dry cleaning. To this day, it is unknown how Fortney created the pleating. Asian art. Japanese and Chinese influences derive from the late 19th century trends in fine and decorative arts. Asian influences can be seen in fabric design and color. Kimonos became a popularly worn leisurely wear style for men and women. The changing social roles of American women. Over 5 million women entered the workforce in 1900. Clothing was needed to accommodate the more active lifestyle of women, so skirts were shortened, the shirtwaist blouse and the skirt were widely adopted. The changing role of women in society were beginning to become accepted. The automobile. The first automobile created in 1900 was considered a toy for the rich due to its high price tag. Due to the automobile being open, there was no roof or windows. The attire of the automobile drivers was made to protect them against the elements like dust, debris, and sun. Men wore a duster, which was a long cotton or linen-like coat, a cap with a visor, and goggles. Women wore a face veil, often in the color green, to minimize glare, and a duster or coat. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T, allowing automobiles to be more widely accessible. American high society and the production and acquisition of clothing. American high society. Fashion-conscious women kept up with fashion via photographs, articles, and drawings. Lower-class women obtained less expensive versions of popular styles. The production and acquisition of clothing. Ready-to-wear was a mature industry by the 1920s. Middle-class clothing consumption was dominated by patterns of mass production and the sale of ready-to-wear clothing in the U.S. during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Costume components for women, 1900 to 1908. This period is reflective of Edwardian styles, or styles with an emphasis on the S-shaped silhouette. Decorative petticoats and drawers continue to be popular. Underclothing has an eyelet insertion of ivory, pink, or blue ribbon that was threaded through, as well as lace edging and ribbon. Generally, dresses were made of one piece and had an S-shaped silhouette. Collars were high and boned. Bodices were pouched, and skirts were flat in the front and emphasized a rounded hip line in the back. Skirts flared into the shape of a trumpet. Lingerie dresses were popular white, frilly cotton or linen dresses with decorations such as tucking, pleating, lace insertions, bands of fabric, lace, and embroidery. Jabots were frill ruffles that were placed at the front of the neck. Costume components for women continued from the 1900s to the 1908. Bishop sleeves were worn in the first half of the decade. This sleeve style was gathered into the armhole and full below the elbow with fabric puffed or pouched at the wrist. In the latter half of the century, Japanese influence could be seen with kimono-style sleeves. Goring was used to shape skirts. This look was created by using panels that, when put together, fit parts of the body, such as the hips, and flared out in others, generally toward the bottom. Skirt lengths varied from ending several inches above the ground, while others had trains. Tailor-made was an important garment for women. Known today as the suit, this garment consisted of a jacket that varied in length, ending anywhere from the waist to below the hip. Shorter jackets were usually fitted, and long jackets were at times loose and sack-like. Affluent women wore Fortney's gowns as tea gowns. These were soft and less fitted and were worn in the late afternoon, while less affluent women wore wrappers, which were loose fitting, one piece garments that were made for relaxing at home. Cloaks and capes were worn outdoors, with Medici collars and rivers. Cloaks varied in length and were fitted or unfitted. Capes were popular for the evening. Stockings were dark or neutral cotton lisles, worn for daytime. Silk stockings were worn for formal wear. Sometimes they had colored clocks, which was a knitted design or a lace insertion. Pointed toe shoes were also fashionable. The pompadour was an important style. This style was built by having the hair piled high at the front and at the sides of the face. Pitcher hats and brimless toques were popular. The decoration of hats was lavish. Feathers and bird wings were used often to the extent that birds almost became extinct. Small pearl skull caps, called Juliet caps, were worn in the evening, as were other hair ornaments such as feathers and jeweled combs. Accessories included large flat muffs, suede or leather handbags for the daytime, beaded handbags for evening, fabric or ostrich fans for the evening, triangular shaped belts. Swiss belts were also revived from the 1860s. Clasps, brooches, pendants, necklaces, dog collars, and long necklaces, pendants, or single stone earrings were also worn. Most of these jewelry items were made in the Art Nouveau style. Costume components for women, 1909 through 1914. Although Poiret claimed to free women from corsets, many continued to wear them. The amount of undergarments worn decreased. Combination undergarments decorated with lace and embroidery were now referred to as knickers. The empire silhouette was also revived. The silhouette became narrower, however, after 1909. Princess petticoats, which were camisole-like tops with a petticoat, also became popular. Skirts were narrowed at the ankles, with the most extreme style being the hobble skirt. Peg-top skirts had hip fullness, which then narrowed gradually to the ankles. Poiret designed the exotic menure tunic, which was wide and boned to hold the skirt out in a circle. It was worn over the hobble skirt. Long or 3/4 quarter length coats were worn in the daytime. Looser coats with a full cut across the back with cape-like sleeves were worn for evening. Hair was worn in soft waves around the face and pulled into a soft bun. Large hats were also worn. Cami knickers, a combination garment with a camisole and a skirt buttoned under the crotch, became popular as the skirt shortened. Pullovers, knitted sweaters with long sleeves and not a defined waist, pulled over the head and belted at the waist, became popular after 1915. Coats were made wider to accommodate skirts. One of the most popular styles had a full back. Hair was worn shorter and closer to the face with permanent waves. Rayon stockings were introduced as an alternative to silk. Tonics, creams, makeup like foundation, rouge, and eyeliner was also used. Costume components for women, 1918 through 1920. This was a transitional period from wartime styles to the styles of the 1920s. The silhouettes changed from narrow to wide. Barrel shaped, which was dresses with narrow hems and wide waistlines, were popular in 1918 and 1919. Chemise dresses also became popular in the 1920s. Costume components for men. Suits were worn by all men for important occasions. Vests were also worn. After the turn of the century, they were light or colored. By the 1910s, they matched the suit. Suits were dark in color except for the summer. Dark blue wool serge was the most popular fabric used to create suits. Post-war, morning coats were limited to the upper class or political leaders. Sports jackets, also known as a sack jacket, was worn for leisure time. Four-in-hand ties, which is today's standard necktie, was also worn. Ascots, which were ties with wide ends, which was worn with one end looped over the other and held with a tie pin, were also popular. Tailcoats and tuxedo jackets with matching trousers and a dark or white waistcoat was worn in the evening. Outerwear consisted of sweaters worn by the working class men, overcoats, which were initially full to accommodate the suit but later became more fitted, top coats, which were worn by affluent men, and military influences were evident amongst a lot of the outerwear. Clothing for active sports and loungewear, as well as sleepwear. Clothing for active sports. Blazers were worn for tennis, yachting, or other sports. The Norfolk jacket was worn for golf, bicycling, and hiking. Jodhups were worn for riding. These originated in India and were adopted by the British. They were trousers that fitted closely around the lower leg and then flared out above the knee. Loungewear and sleepwear consisted of dressing gowns, smoking jackets, and nightshirts. Men wore their hair short. Their beards and mustaches were no longer popular. Panama hats were worn in the summer. Their footwear consisted of stockings in neutral colors, long pointed toe shoes, which were worn in the earlier part of the century. Also, patent leather slippers were popular for evening wear. Oxfords were also used, more increasingly so, after 1910. They were worn in white buckskin for the summer. Accessories included the walking stick, which was popular pre-automobile. Jewelry consisted of tie pins, shirt studs, rings, and cufflinks. Wrist watches became popular due to the wartime use and because of the increased use of automobiles. Costume components for children. Girls. White, light, or cream colored lingerie dresses were worn. Blue serge, sailor dresses, sailor hats, and pinafores were popular for school. Gym tunics were worn over blouses. They also wore flat slippers, and knee-length stockings were worn from 1900 to 1910. Boys. Small boys dressed in skirts until ages 3 or 4. Little boys dressed in rompers. Older boys dressed in knickers, long cardigan sweaters, and also turtleneck sweaters were worn as outerwear. Norfolk jackets or Mackinaw coats were also worn for outerwear. Boys wore high lace shoes, and knee length socks were worn with their knickers.